Hey, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive into a concept within Leonardo da Vinci's A Treatise on Painting that focuses in on two color ideas that every painter still needs to know, even though da Vinci articulated these in his lessons so long ago. Within this wonderful abridged version of A Treatise on Painting, that I dog-eared, and I have so many notes and dog-eared pages. And by the way, this video is intended to be kind of like a companion video, if you will, to a more in-depth, broader review of this book, where I take you through the structure and some of my favorite quotes. But we're going to focus in here in this version on page 126 and 127, where this compilation of lessons from Da Vinci when he taught his students, where he focuses in on kind of the way color reacts within a scene. And there's a lot of detail that hangs off of this, but we're going to focus in on this diagram here, where he uses this as a visual aid to express some broader thoughts about reflected color. And in this section here, where he talks about the fact that no reflected color is simple, but is mixed with the nature of other colors. And if you kind of just sit and observe light within a particular scene, some examples of this might be out in nature, if there's light bouncing off of water, and other elements and objects within a natural scene. Another good example of this might be in a church or a house of worship where there's stained glass and perhaps maybe white walls. You can actually see how color plays throughout a scene like that. And he goes into some detail about how painted a certain color and is reflected off of an object will take on properties of other reflected light sources. So, for example, and he goes into a lot of detail here, if you had light that was being reflected off of, let's say, a green floor plane, and it bounced up onto a white wall, you would see evidence of that green hue in the reflected light. However, if there was another area where there was yellow, that would tinge that color. A better example might be a blue object reflecting light and then a yellow object reflecting light, and that would actually cause the tinted light to color mix, and it would have a green tint to it. So yeah, this concept is very, very interesting to me and a lot of different artists. So we're going to actually run through that and give you some examples of how that might play out in a natural scene. And then in the same section, just a few pages later, there's a very key concept that is really important for landscape painters for a number of reasons. If you want your scenes to look more natural, if you want to create the illusion of depth within your scenes, amazingly enough, Leonardo takes us through some observations that are critically important for landscape painters, and it relates to the perspective of colors. He touches upon, I guess, what would be an early definition of aerial perspective, and then also dives a little bit deeper and speaks to the impact of our point of view on planet Earth here and how that impacts how we see or perceive the atmospheric effects on horizon line and throughout the broader scene that we might be observing in nature. And he kind of articulates very efficiently how when we look across the landscape, if you will, at the horizon line, the sky will shift. There'll be gradients of color that will naturally occur where, if you had, let's say, a nice sunny day where the sky was filled with a relatively even plane of cloud cover, um, and there were you could actually observe the shifts in color across the sky plane, and as it gets closer to the horizon, you'll actually see a little bit of a warming of the color temperature, and in addition to that, a desaturation happening simultaneously. And this gradient shift in both saturation and hue or color temperature will actually enhance if we observe it correctly and apply the translation of that observation to our paintings or our drawings. It'll help us create depth and more realistic kind of feel. The painting will read a little bit better. So we'll demonstrate that. Here's the diagram that's used in his book, which is pretty amazing, and it speaks to the fact that the light that we view closer to the horizon needs to travel through more atmospheric particulates, and there's interference that occurs at a higher rate because of that when the light is reflecting off of our eyes and we're seeing it. Whereas opposed to when we're looking up directly at that sky, at the sky above our heads, there's less atmospheric interference, so we're more likely to see the blue sky on that example of a day where it's a sunny day and there are blue skies. Alternatively, once again, the further down the sky dome we go, and closer to the horizon we go with our observation of the sky on that very same day, the light is going to have to travel through more atmospheric static, and it'll shift the color in a gradient format for us, which is really, really interesting, and something that a lot of people, it's an observation that a lot of people miss. So we're going to slide this out of view here. What I'm going to do to demonstrate this, we're going to go to my sketchbook, and we're actually going to go in reverse order. I have two examples in mind in my sketchbook here, and I'm probably going to use, I think I'm going to use casein to demonstrate this. You see, I've used the sketchbook for demonstrations of other concepts from other books. Put some paint down. It's a little less expensive. It's water soluble, and I think it'll apply nicely to the smooth multimedia paint surface that I have here within the sketch pad. We have I put down cadmium red. I have dioxazine purple, I believe, here. This casein paint is interesting. The binder is a milk-based protein. It looks and feels a lot like gouache. I have a little raw sienna. I have some some ultramarine blue. There we go. Shouldn't be much more than that. Okay. All right. So dioxazine purple, cadmium red, burnt sienna, black, raw sienna, titanium white. And we're just going to go ahead and demonstrate a little bit about how this concept would actually work, and a couple of thumbnail sketches that we'll do in this multimedia book. So when we multimedia sketchbook. So when we think about the concept of the perspective of colors, it's really interesting. So if we had a landscape where there was a there was a ground plane, and I'm using kind of a mixture of my raw sienna and black. I get a little bit of my burnt sienna in there. Get a little mass of trees. Okay. Now, if we were looking at this and making the observation about, you know, what the sky plane might look like, it's really helpful to consider this notion that there's going to be a gradient, uh, an actual gradient change in the sky plane. Now, if we look at the sky, just using a little bit of my ultramarine blue and titanium white, and we looked above our heads, we would see, you know, some version of, you know, a nice light blue shade on a sunny day. And then gradually what happens when you have full view of the sky plane like this, it'll actually shift. It'll go from, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mix in a little bit of white and a little bit of purple into this mixture. We'll have a warmer, desaturated blue, almost a gray, grayed out blue, if you will. And this might have, depending upon the actual atmospheric conditions and um, you know, the nature of the scene and that you're observing, you know, this might work a little bit differently. You might have more pinks. You might have almost a pure white toward the horizon. But it's just really important to note that this gradient, to some degree or another, is going to form. And it won't be, in most cases, a real even transition, you know, depending upon the actual nature of the cloud cover and the atmosphere. But generally speaking, you're going to see a transition which will look something like this. And that's because when you're looking up at the sky above you, there's, as a matter of just measurement, there's going to be less atmosphere, fewer particulates that are going to interfere with your view of the sky dome, you know, the actual top of the sky in our atmosphere here, than there will be if you're peering across the horizon and looking at the sky closer to the horizon. So this gradient, to one degree or another, will always be there, and it'll be altered based upon the atmospheric conditions of that particular moment and that day and the landscape that you're looking at. And this is a critical thing to just be aware of. And I know, you know, lots of painters who are sensitive toward, these sorts of observations will actually notice this, but they won't actually have a way of articulating it until they read something like this passage from Da Vinci's treatise on painting. So I figured it was worth highlighting. And there's a couple of other things that come along with this too. You know, as you develop as a painter, the actual, if you take this concept and complement it with a suggestion of, so you're using aerial perspective here, but you could also use this in conjunction with linear perspective. So you may have, more visible cloud shapes. And while you have this gradient, the sky gradient working for you, you can also account for a similar change in color temperature, and in addition to that, the actual linear perspective that'll affect the actual scale or size of your depiction of the clouds as they get closer to that sky plane. So they'll warm up, generally speaking, not always, but more often than not, they'll warm up as you get closer to the horizon, and then they'll also, they'll appear to be smaller in size. And by using this, even from a completely imaginary, unplanned scene like this, you can further enhance the kind of suggestion, the illusion of three-dimensionality. Now, in reality, this light will bounce. The colored reflected light, tinted reflected light will bounce throughout the scene, but it'll be, that'll bring us to our next part of this discussion, actually. We'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Oops. Okay. So you can see we have clouds that are getting smaller, cloud shapes that are getting smaller, and generally a little bit warmer as we get closer to the horizon. And the intended impact there is to, and more desaturated, I would add too. Now the intention there is to create that illusion of three-dimensionality. So that sky plane that covers the Earth, indicating the top level of our atmosphere, it's subject to the same laws as the rest of the environment that we're in. So there's some predictability to how we can render scenes so they look familiar. Now, obviously, this is very rough sketch, very kind of impressionistic. Generally, there's a gradient going from richer, darker blue to a much lighter blue, kind of underpinning all of this. And then when when he speaks to the mixing of reflected light, I had thought about a different example, but I'm going to go ahead and use this scene to kind of describe that first concept. So we talked about the perspective of color here, atmospheric perspective. We did it within the context of a landscape scene and really focused in on the impact of this concept that Da Vinci describes as it relates to the use of the sky plane to develop a three-dimensional scene on a two-dimensional surface like we did here. But that first concept that I mentioned earlier had to do with the reflection of colored light. And remember, he states that no reflected color is simple, but it is mixed with the nature of other colors. And this is interesting because a lot of folks, when they think about painting light and shadow, oftentimes will be drawn to the idea of doing it in absolute terms. So, for example, some folks might say, okay, well, if I wanted to do shadows of these trees, I would just do, a darker version. I would use a darker version of the color for the ground plane, or maybe black, or one solid color like a purple or a blue. Or in the case of a snow scene, a lot of folks will just use pure blue, suggesting that those areas in shadow on a sunny day in a snow scene would just reflect the blue, color of the sky in those shadows. And that could work well in some instances to create the illusions we want to create in a painting. But the paintings that I observe that really have kind of a special or extraordinarily beautiful reflection of nature, they'll have they'll have a little bit more of a dynamic use of color, both reflected color and in shadow. And nature is that way. So I just added, for example, a little bit of pure dioxazine purple to that shadow that I laid in that consisted mostly of black and raw umber. And now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take some of my blue and I'm going to get that in there too, just to show how if we were, let's say the light source was up and to the right, let's say the sun was over here, it was a high sky, midday type scenario. We would have shadows both within these tree shapes, but also on the ground that would include light that was bouncing from every direction. And sometimes there would be color mixing that would occur in the scene as a result of that, which is really, really interesting. It's really, if you practice the observation and the application of this concept, it really is a freeing, it can be very freeing because you have no choice but to kind of surrender to the fact that there's just so much detail in nature that no matter how effective we are as a painter, and no matter um, how efficient we get, and how good we get at rendering a scene and accounting for every detail, we're never gonna we're always gonna be painting in the abstract. And then by surrendering to this idea that reflected light is going to mix, whoops, a little too heavy handed there. That's okay, we're going to use that to our advantage. Is going to mix as part of the natural occurrence of reflected light. You can let go of the tendency to want to control everything and use that to your advantage to kind of free yourself with the understanding that perfect color matching is maybe less important in the effort to create an interesting painter. So you could see right there, I kind of haphazardly, mixed colors on my brush, on my surface. So we have blues mixing with raw sienna, creating kind of like a green. Now, there's also, beyond the two lessons within Da Vinci's notes here that are comprised, that this book, A Treatise on Painting, are comprised of, there's a lot more detail to the anatomy of a shadow. And maybe we'll walk through that in a separate video. The intention here is just to spotlight two time-tested principles that were put forward by Da Vinci in his lessons that ultimately were consolidated by his students up into this book called The Treatise of Painting. They're really, really important, and they play a really significant role in helping painters that are interested in growing and learning. And I can almost remember the first time that I kind of was able to articulate these two concepts within my mind. And for me, it was a significant moment because it helped me advance my painting practice pretty significantly. So we're going to leave this part of the demo here, and we're going to transition over to a recent snow scene painting that I completed. Snow scenes in particular do a really nice job of illustrating that concept that Da Vinci shared, suggesting that no reflected color is simple. With snow, it is white, and therefore it'll actually reflect all the colors surrounding it. So you can see pinks and oranges, yellows, and blues, along with purples and other hues. Well, there you have it. Hopefully you enjoyed this discussion about these two elements described in Da Vinci's A Treatise on Painting. The idea of color mixing that occurs within color-tinted reflected light, and also one of the key concepts associated with aerial perspective and how perspective of color is really, really important when it comes to that color shift that you see across the sky plane. All described by Leonardo da Vinci hundreds of years ago, before we reach this technological revolution that we're currently in. So an amazing way with a painter and Renaissance man, maybe the Renaissance man, has influenced the world of painting and creativity. Leonardo wasn't just inventing techniques, he was studying perception. Two observations from the treatise still quietly govern convincing painting efforts amongst all of us artists. Once you see them, you can't unsee them. It's important to emphasize here that Leonardo wasn't teaching us how to paint like him. He was actually teaching us how to see, and all of his thoughts that he shared with his students about how to see the world as a painter, as a creative, as a person, are shared within a treatise on painting. So remember to check out its companion video here on the channel where I summarize the entire abridged version of the treatise on painting. I'll include the link to the free version of the original copy that's available in PDF format in this video, just like I did for the earlier companion video that I just mentioned. Thanks for watching. Stay well. Hope to see you again soon.